also been completed by Kelsey Carpenter, Elizabeth Tosto, Emma Bonilla-Cobbett, Rachel Rosenblatt, Brianna Meyer, and Charlotte Williamson. Children with autism spectrum disorder exhibit a unique collection of symptoms. These include deficits in the areas of socialization, communication, and interests and activities. A person with autism spectrum disorder may have a narrow range of interests that involve restricted behaviors and the tendency to perseverate on a single topic or activity. Patterns of repetitive and restrictive behaviors, also described as stereotypies, often develop and serve multiple functions for a child. Self-injurious behaviors are common in children with autism spectrum disorders, according to research by Baghdadli, Pascal, Greasy, and Ossolu. Their findings show that 50% of children in the study experience self-injurious behavior, with 14.6% at severe levels. These behaviors can have far-reaching consequences and may restrict children from reaching their full potential. There has been increased concern in developing successful interventions for problem behaviors in autism spectrum disorders due to a rise in diagnoses of this disorder. This debate will explore the use of restraints and seclusion to minimize self-injury. Just to be clear, self-injurious behavior is defined as actions that cause or have the potential to cause redness, bruising, or any other injury to the body. It can also include hits with body, hits with object, pulls hair and or skin, hits part of the body against a surface, picks skin, bites self, and or rubs or scratches oneself. The four functions of behavior also apply to self-injurious behavior. These functions are attention, escape or avoidance, access to tangible items, and automatic or stealth stimulation. Because self-injurious behavior is a major concern for the population of children with autism spectrum disorders, some people argue that restraints and seclusion are beneficial to prevent more acceleration of damaging behaviors, while others argue that they are not. The first step in preventing harmful behavior is to assess its functions. To start, the against side will discuss their points. The topics that they will discuss related to restraint to support their argument are the Code of Ethics and Principles of Ethics, which will be discussed by Kelsey Carpenter. Then, Emma will be discussing the effect on maladaptive behaviors. And lastly, Beth will be discussing injury and death due to ineffective training of restraint.
As with everything we do as behavior analysts, it's important to start this discussion by reflecting back on our professional code of ethics, written by the Behavior Analyst Certification Board. I'm going to highlight some of the most important sections in relation to why we shouldn't be using restraints on children with disabilities. Section 4.8, Considerations Regarding Punishment Procedures, is the first that comes to mind. Section A states that we, as behavior analysts, use reinforcement to absolute exhaustion before considering punishment procedures. This means that before restraints are even considered, the staff would need to prove that they tried everything that would be considered reinforcement. Section D of that same part discusses that aversive procedures always include a high level of training, supervision, and oversight. As someone who works in the field, I can say from my experience that this is not always the case. If aversive measures are being used, they need to be supervised by someone who has knowledge of the training methods and the research behind them. They should also make sure that the staff follows all of the appropriate procedures for after the restraint is used, including a check by the nurse, filling out the right paperwork, etc. Without supervision, a 2-day training just isn't enough to take such serious action. Section D also discusses that behavior analysts need to evaluate whether the procedure has proven to be effective, as well as have a plan to end the aversive procedure. While I have seen restraint procedures be included in behavior intervention plans for students who have severe behavioral challenges as a means for crisis prevention, I've never seen a plan to discontinue these procedures. If we cannot follow the code effectively, we shouldn't be using them at all. Section 9.1 states that we need to follow all laws and regulations. Many behavior analysts are not even aware of the federal and state laws that apply to restraints, therefore, they are not necessarily following them. This continues my point that the majority of behavior analysts are simply unprepared to successfully perform restraint techniques. To further that discussion, Section 1.2 of the Code discusses the boundaries of competence of a BCBA. We are only allowed to work within our boundaries of competence, and we shouldn't be considered trained after only 2 days of classes where we are not put into real life situations. A class where we practice the techniques on our colleagues should not constitute crisis training. It's also important to note that it would be outside our boundaries of competence to teach others how to use these techniques. In addition to the Code of Ethics, behavior analysts also operate by the principles of ethics. Some of the core principles I'm going to relate to restraint and seclusion are respect for autonomy, being just, and most importantly, do no harm. When you put a child into restraints, you are taking away their right to move their body freely. They are not making choices for themselves when you are controlling their body for them. They are also losing their right to be free from embarrassment. Every time an individual uses their body to control someone else's, they are taking away that person's right to autonomy. The children we work with often have impaired cognitive ability, which means they are already at a diminished capacity to make choices for themselves. They also often have limited ability to communicate their thoughts, feelings, wants, and needs. It should also be noted that children often act out and have these negative behaviors as a form of communication. If a child with limited communication skills is put into a restraint incorrectly and is in pain, they could be unable to tell you that they can't breathe or that their arm really hurts. We work every day to be advocates for these children. If we are the ones that are unintentionally hurting them, what does that say about us? Being just refers to the fact that all individuals have the same rights, regardless of disability or behaviors. We need to use the least amount of force necessary when working with our students. Behavior analysts view our clients and students as people first. If we wouldn't want someone to do it to us, ethically, we should not be doing it to our students. Most importantly, we operate by the principle of do no harm. Behavior analysts always act in the best interest of our clients and do not do anything that could harm them. When you use restraints, even if you are appropriately trained, you are accepting the risk of potentially hurting the individual, even if it is unintentional. Some of the potential physical risks are broken bones, bruises, and, unfortunately, in serious cases, death. Not to mention that even if the individual is not physically harmed by the restraint, the emotional trauma can be just as harmful. Individuals with disabilities often struggle with their emotions, and they cannot necessarily process what happened after the restraint is over. There can also be social harm if the restraints are done while in view of other students or teachers.
Hi guys, this is Emma, and I would like to share why I believe that the use of restraints may unknowingly reinforce maladaptive behaviors, and when used incorrectly, how restraints can be unethical. I will also discuss the role a behavior analyst plays in the use of restraints. First, I'll start by sharing that according to an article by McGee and Ellis, the use of physical restraints may positively reinforce maladaptive behaviors. For example, attention-seeking behavior and escape avoidance behavior may be reinforced or maintained by the use of physical restraints. A student who is seeking attention may engage in a behavior that he knows will require the use of physical restraint, and therefore he will be provided with adult attention. A student who is trying to escape or avoid a task may engage in a certain behavior because he knows a physical restraint will be used and he'll be able to escape the demand, at least momentarily. The study highlights the importance of identifying and evaluating events that may be functionally related to the problem behavior. Rather than using physical restraints, the author suggests the use of differential reinforcement and extinction, which we use every day as behavior analysts. The function of a maladaptive behavior should be identified prior to the use of physical restraints. Not all teachers are educated on the functions of behavior and may unknowingly be reinforcing or maintaining the problem behavior. A functional assessment or a functional analysis should be conducted. Once the function of a behavior is determined, the more effective intervention can be used rather than just the use of physical restraint. Lastly, I'd like to add that the use of physical restraints cannot be easily generalized to another environment. For instance, if a client were to engage in physical aggression in a home setting, it's unlikely that there would be 2 or 3 trained adults who can implement safe restraint procedures. BCBAs have extensive experience in determining the function of a behavior. For an educator, it may be more difficult to quickly assess the function and implement a correct intervention. In a clinical setting where ABA therapists work one-on-one with clients, the therapists are trained on how to determine the function of a behavior and how to implement the client's behavior intervention plan appropriately. At my ABA clinic, therapists are observed regularly to ensure behavior intervention plan is implemented correctly based on the function of the behavior. BCBAs are available at all times to assist in the de-escalation of maladaptive behaviors or to coach us through new strategies if a behavior intervention plan isn't working as according to plan. In a school setting, a BCBA may not be as accessible. In my clinic, we have BCBAs, multiple BCBAs that we can reach by a quick phone call, and they will be out on the floor with us almost immediately. In our field, we are constantly working towards our clients' independence, and it's the therapist and BCBA's duty to assist their client in functionally communicating as needed. According to Ethical Code 4.0, behavior change programs should teach new, appropriate, and adaptive behaviors using non-harmful reinforcers. For example, functional language such as "I'm frustrated" or "I need a break" can be taught. The use of functional communication is more likely to be generalized in the home setting when compared to the use of restraints, which would not easily be generalized. In addition, the use of physical restraints would not allow a non-vocal client who uses ASL or an AAC device to communicate functionally, since when restrained, he or she would not be able to move their arms or hands freely. Overall, I find restraints to be a quick fix rather than a long-term intervention. Determining the function of a behavior and providing appropriate and alternative behaviors can help reduce the need for restraints.
Professionals that use restraint claim that it is necessary to manage dangerous behaviors. People who advocate for child safety state that there are far too many children who become injured or die when these professionals restrain them. The Child Welfare League of America is an organization that works on reducing restraint and seclusion. In 2004, they stated that between 8 and 10 deaths occur every year due to restraint. They also discussed the countless number of broken bones, bruises, bites, and damaged joints that result in it as well. Most hospitals, psychiatric, and law enforcement applications have strict guidelines that govern the use of restraint, but most schools or child care agencies do not have such standards. School systems do not have strict guidelines for restraint and oftentimes result in using it. The use of restraint is recognized by the professional community as a widely used protective procedure often implemented for a variety of reasons, including prevention of violence, self-injurious behavior, and injury or property damage due to temper tantrums, as well as a response to noncompliance. Teachers should be educated on other alternatives to restraint or preventative methods. Many school-based programs may offer alternatives or preventative methods, but one specific element that seems to be missing in the training is crisis management itself. There are many training programs out there, but are these training programs as effective in caring for student safety? According to a review of crisis training programs for schools, selecting a training program for a school can be hard for an administrator. It can be difficult to find a course that matches what types of physical interventions they need based on and specialized in their student population. These trainings are not individualized based on a case-by-case basis, and those that do the trainings still may use the information incorrectly. Most training programs, such as safety care, nonviolence crisis intervention, or right response, include only 12 to 16 hours. Only attending 12 hours of training on something that is imperative to an individual, they must be sure they are doing it correctly, and it doesn't seem like enough time to master it. There are always then discussions on exactly how much time an individual should have trainings on the use of restraint. Another concern that pertains to the use of restraint is for those individuals who experience sensitivity to touch, like some individuals with developmental disabilities may exhibit. An article I read discussed how there are not many training programs available out there right now that provide people undergoing the training about trauma care or specific to a disability or diagnosis. We have behavior intervention plans and educational plans that are individualized, yet there is not a training program that will specialize to a specific disorder or disability. Also, these training programs do not specialize in teaching individuals how to restrain young children in a different way than they would of an adult. These techniques that are taught in these programs may not be appropriate to use with small children, as they might seriously injure them. The article, A Review of Crisis Training Programs for Schools, discussed how schools should spend less time finding a training program for restraint that would fit with their dynamic and more time finding trainings that would focus on preventative programs. These preventative programs would be most useful to schools because they may even eliminate the use of restraint or stop particularly severe dangerous behaviors from beginning in the first place. With the history of injuries, deaths, broken bones, it is crucial that instead of using restraint, individuals who work with people that engage in dangerous or self-injurious behaviors should receive trainings on preventative measures to use instead. Sections of the BACB Ethical Code and Principles for Behavior Analysts relate to why we should not use restraint or seclusion with children with disabilities. Section 4.8, Considerations Regarding Punishment Procedures of the Code, states that behavior analysts use reinforcement to absolute exhaustion before considering punishment procedures. All other forms of reinforcement should be used, and an individual must prove they have done so. Section 9.1 states that we need to follow all laws and regulations. Many behavior analysts do not know their own state's laws and regulations, and most likely are not following them due to this. Specific principles of ethics being violated are respect for anonymity, being just, and do no harm. The use of restraints may unknowingly reinforce maladaptive behaviors. Behaviors that are due to attention-seeking or escape avoidance may be maintained by the use of restraint. Identifying the events or antecedents that are functionally related to the problem behavior is something that needs to be done rather than using physical restraint. Finding out the function of a behavior and teaching alternative and appropriate behaviors can reduce the need to use restraint. Professionals that use restraint claim it is necessary to manage dangerous behaviors. People who advocate for child safety state that far too many children become injured or die when these professionals restrain them. Schools often have inadequate training for use of physical restraint on students, and schools should spend less time finding a training for restraint that fits with their dynamic and find trainings that focus on preventative programs.
The force side will now discuss the documents related to restraint to support their argument. I, Catherine, will be doing the introduction. Following me will be Rachel, who will be discussing the history of restraint. After her will be Charlotte, discussing types of restraints. And lastly, Bree will be talking about the proactive measures and debriefing of restraints. Physical interventions may have short-term and long-term detrimental implications for the clinician. Because of this, regulatory agencies and advocacy groups are pushing for a reduction in the use of restraint. However, there are clinical situations for which verbal and behavioral techniques are not effective, and the use of seclusion and restraint becomes necessary to prevent harm to the patient and or staff. When use of restraint and seclusion is unavoidable, there are measures that can be taken to mitigate some of the negative consequences that may result when such actions are taken. In an article by Banda, McAfee, and Hart, they discuss subject self-injury decrease significantly during the use of restraints. Restraints do not have to be looked at as something permanent, but something that can be utilized in an emergency situation and or a safety net. When people think of restraints, they think of violence and abuse, but if restraints can be used to momentarily protect multiple individuals and also possibly teach someone how to restrain themselves, the long-term outcome is beneficial to all. The article goes on and further discusses fading restraints while simultaneously decreasing self-injurious behaviors. If restraints are originally used to decrease self-injurious behaviors and then are able to be faded out, they can serve a great purpose in someone's life regarding long-term effects and may not be required forever. High incidences of self-injurious behavior occurred, mainly during non-preferred activities. Data was inconsistent, varying frequency, duration, and severity. Self-restraint involving other people was able to be decreased to self-monitored self-restraint, where the subject would wrap his hands tightly in a blanket. If we can implement a plan for different individuals that start at multi-persons involved restraints, it can then lead to less persons involved restraints, which then leads to self-monitored restraints, which then leads to no restraints, and then a need for restraints in the first place can be argued useful. Even though we're ending with no restraints, we had to start using them and slowly fade the process out. So again, they were useful at a certain point, and therefore this side discusses why they are for restraints and seclusion.
The history of restraint spans almost 200 years, but it is almost all about use in psychiatric institutions. As you can see on the slides, many cases were brought to court under the 14th Amendment, and Wyatt and Stickney is one of those cases. There are three types of restraint that were allowed in these institutions: physical, mechanical, and chemical. The first law was set in 1740. It granted permission to public authorities to restrain an unruly person under the assumption it would benefit to the person and would lead to satiation of the behavior. This is when restraint became more accepted as an intervention for aggressive behavior toward a person's self or others. The CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medical Aid Services, added on to this that there must be an observer of any restraint done and a debrief afterward with all included. I want to address the definition of restraint, which is any physical method of restricting an individual's freedom of movement, physical activity, or normal access to his or her own body. This does not always mean that they go to the floor in a restraint. CPI in their training do not actually train floor restraints in their first level. Restraint is different than therapeutic holding that may be less restrictive way to support a child through an intervention. In many cases, in a school, hand-over-hand prompt is used to help a child complete a task, and even that could be considered a type of therapeutic hold. Arnie Duncan, in 2012 as Secretary of Education, wrote a document entitled the Restraint and Seclusion Resource Document to be reviewed by all public and private schools. and create policies around restraint and seclusion methods. This child with extreme aggressive outbursts. Now, everyone is shaking their head and saying, how could you ever restrain a 5-year-old? I will explain. The risk was high. He could hurt himself or others. He had broke my nose at one point and bit my arms multiple times. And the likelihood it would happen was only in the unlikely to likely range. He did not have outbursts every day and could go weeks without them. So this environment was suited for him. It was the least restrictive environment for his educational needs. This instance, we had to clear the room of all the other students, and only me and one other staff stayed with him. We allowed him to tear the room apart, saying as though inanimate objects are not our concern. At the point that he climbed up on the counter and had access to other materials and items such as scissors, we had to do something about it. We brought him down off the counter and put him in a child support position. Now, I did not say restraint, and he could still move his body and walk if he chose. I tried to transport him to a safer area, and he still continued to headbang, attempt to bite, and kick me. All this time, there was a trained observer as well. Anyway, this whole story was the span of 10 minutes, only 2 of which were in a true restraint, and a debrief of his behavior plan and behavioral expectations were explained to him the next day.
Hi, I'm Charlotte, and I'm here to discuss some types of restraints used in the field. Autism spectrum disorders represent several symptoms, one of which includes some behavioral tendencies. These tendencies can lead to severe injuries to the individual or others involved, present safety risks, and in the worst case scenario, death of the individual. Restraints are an option schools and individual facilities use to assist in calming the individual engaging a behavior and to hopefully prevent some of these serious issues from happening. 2 of the structured training programs used in order to prevent individuals from reaching a crisis are Professional Crisis Management, which is PCM, and the Crisis Prevention Institute, CPI, training methods. Both of these training programs place an emphasis on crisis prevention. PCM includes crisis prevention, crisis de-escalation, intervention, and post-crisis intervention components to ease these situations. PCM defines a crisis as continuous aggression, continuous self-injury, or continuous high-magnitude disruption. Continuous is further defined as repeated demonstration of behaviors, which in this case, that are harmful to others, self-injurious, or potentially damaging to the environment. Types of physical restraints used in PCM are transportation procedures, vertical immobilizations, and horizontal immobilizations. And the horizontal immobilizations are prone immobilizations and supine immobilizations. The horizontal immobilization procedures are also known as brief assisted required relaxation procedures. Transportation procedures can be implemented when the crisis criteria, which is continuous aggression, continuous self-injury, or continuous high-magnitude disruption, are met in order to de-escalate a crisis and keep everyone involved in the situation safe. In order to implement a horizontal immobilization procedure, transportation procedures must have been broken down, safety equipment must be available, and practitioners must be certified. A prone immobilization is a horizontal immobilization which involves an individual being restrained on his or her stomach. A supine immobilization is also a horizontal immobilization which involves an individual restrained on his or her back. Each immobilization requires the breakdown of transportation procedures, availability of the safety equipment, and that the practitioners implementing the procedure are certified. This certification is extremely important so that practitioners implementing the procedures do so correctly to keep everyone safe and that the client dignity and privacy is protected. I work at an ABA clinic that uses PCM procedures. Upon admittance to the center, consent is required by parents for approval of these procedures if a client meets these crisis criteria. The approval supports assessing Behavior Compliance Code 3.03, which discusses behavior analytic assessment consent. It is important that parents and caregivers approve these procedures before they are implemented. At the center I work for, each ABA therapist becomes certified in PCM before they are able to implement the procedures. The policy at our center is that we follow the guidelines of PCM in a crisis situation, and the client generally has PCM in their behavior plan if the client has frequently met the crisis criteria. If a client does not have the PCM procedures in their behavior intervention plan, it is still required that individuals would use PCM procedures if the client meets the crisis criteria, which again are continuous aggression, continuous self-injury, or continuous high magnitude disruption. And the procedures would be implemented as long as the practitioners are certified. If an individual is not certified in PCM and a client is near meeting these criteria, the individual must immediately call for help. And this ensures that safety of the client and individuals involved in the procedures that are being implemented are trained and the staff members are certified. Making sure that staff is trained and constantly reviewed also supports responsible conduct for Behavior Analysts Compliance Code 1.20, which addresses boundaries of competence. It is imperative that behavior analysts provide services only within their boundaries of competence, meaning that if one were to implement a treatment procedure, they would be following the criteria of implementation under their certification, like PCM. BICL also addresses the importance of having trained staff in order to implement procedures. Staff should use appropriate evidence-based practice intervention techniques in order to minimize risk of physical injury, and certification processes are required to implement these procedures. Reviewing the appropriateness of each physical procedure requires ongoing staff training. Physical restraint is required in some situations in order to prevent injury to students and staff involved in the situation. Situations that may warrant physical restraints could involve students fighting, intentional or unintentional self-injury, and/or students that may be in possession of a weapon. It is important that restraints are only used for the amount of time to accomplish its purpose.
We should constantly be holding ourselves accountable for the decisions we make as behavior analysts, behavior technicians, specialists, and so on, by asking ourselves, is the child or a peer in immediate danger? Are we properly trained, or do we feel the risk of not restraining is greater than the risk of restraining? And finally, are we using this measure as a last resort? If the answer to any of these questions is no, restraints should not be used. This is to ensure that only effective and safe techniques will be used by qualified staff. It is important to note that according to the Association of Behavior Analysts International, the use of restraints is not a treatment for challenging behavior, but a tool for safety in dangerous situations. In the event of imminent and immediate danger, restraints or seclusion may be necessary to prevent harm. According to Simonson et al. 2014,
In the event of a restraint, parents should be notified and a team debriefing must occur. Proactive measures already in place should be reviewed, and the behavior support plan must be updated. Lastly, the event should be well documented, and this can aid us in preventing the same occurrence in the future.
The Joint Commission and the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services established a standard of care if restraint techniques were necessary. The first law was written in 1740 that allowed law enforcement to use manual restraint on any unruly person. Finally, in 2012, the Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, wrote a document entitled the Restraint and Seclusion Resource Document to be reviewed by all public and private schools. When someone is engaging in dangerous behaviors, death or other injuries may occur. Restraints are an option schools and individual facilities use to assist in calming the individual engaging in a behavior and to hopefully prevent some of these serious issues from happening. Professional crisis management and the Crisis Prevention Institute training method are two quality programs that place an emphasis on crisis prevention and how to safely restrain individuals to avoid injury. Restraints should be used for the only appropriate amount of time necessary, and staff should only use appropriate evidence-based practice intervention techniques in order to minimize the risk of physical injury. Restraints and seclusion are widely used in a way to keep the client safe as well as their peers as a last resort. Restricting all use of restraints is potentially dangerous to the client, peers, and staff, but limiting and decreasing the use of restraints should be a priority. All use of restraint needs to be documented properly.
So what about the Code of Ethics? The opposing side mentioned the Code of Ethics, and in particular a few specific codes including boundaries of competence, punishment procedures, and law. For example, Code 1.02, which states the importance of training and providing services within your competence. Only staff who are properly trained and showed competency within a state-regulated program should be able to perform restraints. There's no argument there. Code 4.08, which states, before implementing punishment-based procedures, behavior analysts ensure that appropriate steps have been taken to implement reinforcement-based procedures unless the severity of dangerousness or the behavior necessitates immediate use of aversive procedures. It also states that behavior analysts ensure that aversive procedures are accompanied by an increased level of training, supervision, and oversight. Behavior analysts must evaluate the effectiveness of aversive procedures in a timely manner and modify the behavior change program if it is ineffective. Behavior analysts always include a plan to discontinue the use of aversive procedures when no longer needed. I would argue that restraints and seclusions should only be used when reinforcement procedures have been exhausted and ineffective. In other words, as we've been arguing, a last resort. This code explicitly states that the use of aversive measures may be necessary in emergencies in severe and dangerous situations. To expand on that, only staff who have been properly trained and received supervision and oversight should be able to perform this as needed. Also, as mentioned before, debriefing immediately is a way of reducing or discontinuing the need of restraints in the future, or in other words, as the code states, discontinuing the use of aversive procedures. This brings me to Code 9.01, which states that behavior analysts plan and conduct research in a manner consistent with all applicable laws and regulations, as well as professional standards governing the conduct of research. Behavior analysts who comply with must also comply with other applicable laws and regulations relating to mandated reporting requirements. Only the most up-to-date research should be used in order to continue the use of restraints in dire situations. We're behavior analysts. We need to research, we need to analyze the data figure out what is needed or what needs to be continued. And the field of restraints has been changing according to research, data, and events. For example, some states have discontinued the use of certain types of restraints that have been deemed harmful. So, are restraints ethical? It depends on who uses them and how. When restraints are used as a last resort by trained, supervised professionals with proper proactive strategies as well as debriefing in place, and is within the laws and regulations of your state, restraints can serve as a temporary solution for unsafe situations.
Hi, I'm Kelsey, and I'm back to answer some potential questions you might have. One way you can prevent wrongful restraint is by having open conversations with your coworkers so that everyone is on the same page. You should also have proactive strategies in place so that you only use restraint as a last resort. You should also know the state and federal laws and regulations that are applicable to you in case you are in a situation where you feel the need to restrain. If you see an individual being wrongfully restrained, it's your responsibility to report it. I live in New Jersey, so I would call the New Jersey Child Abuse Hotline. You should also report it to your supervisors, including your supervising BCBA. You might be asked to file an incident report about what you saw. If you have questions about restraint and seclusion, please contact your BCBA or whomever is in charge of training in your school district or clinic. You can also contact an individual who works for the program you use. For example, you can call the offices at CPI or PCM and they can assist you in answering any questions.